Clint Eastwood was setting up a shot on one of the biggest films of his career when a voice from behind the cameras said something that made every black actor and crew member freeze in place. A white grip had just called Clint's co-star a word so vile that the air itself seemed to curdle. Before anyone could react, before security could move, Clint was already crossing the set with a look in his eyes that veterans on that crew had never seen before. What happened in the next 60 seconds would shut down production for 5 days and remain buried for decades. It was the summer of 1992, and the Warner Brothers lot in Burbank was buzzing with the kind of energy that only comes when everyone knows they're working on something special. Unforgiven was already generating whispers, a Western that would tear apart everything the genre had ever stood for, directed by and starring the man who had once defined it. Clint Eastwood was about to bury the myth he'd built. The set that morning was crowded with over 100 crew members preparing for one of the film's most emotionally demanding scenes. Cameras, lights, and reflectors were being positioned with surgical precision. The craft services table was picked over from an early call time, and the smell of stale coffee hung in the dry California air. It was hot, the kind of heat that made tempers short even on good days. Clint arrived just after 7, wearing dusty period clothing and his character's worn cowboy hat. He moved through the set the way he always did, quiet, efficient, nodding at familiar faces, but never stopping long enough to get pulled into conversation. At 62 years old, he carried himself with the authority of a man who had nothing left to prove, but still demanded excellence from everyone around him. Morgan Freeman was already in the makeup chair, having his William Money partner look perfected. Gene Hackman was running lines with a young assistant, his voice carrying that dangerous charm that would earn him an Oscar in a few months. The principal cast was tight, professionals who understood the weight of what they were creating. The crew was a mix of veterans who had worked with Clint for years and newer members brought on for the scale of the production. Most of them understood the unwritten rules on a Clint Eastwood set. Show up early, do your job, keep the drama off camera. But not everyone had gotten the memo. A group of grips and gaffers were clustered near the equipment truck, laughing a little too loud about something. One of them, a thick-necked man in his 40s named Ray Jessup, kept glancing toward the makeup trailer with a look that made some of the older crew uncomfortable. The first sign of trouble came during a lighting adjustment. Morgan Freeman had stepped out of the makeup trailer and was walking toward the main set, script pages in hand, quietly running his lines under his breath. He was dressed in full costume, the worn clothes of a reformed killer trying to stay decent in an indecent world. At 55 years old, Morgan carried himself with a dignity that made everyone around him stand a little straighter. Ray Jessup watched him pass. Something flickered across his face, a sneer that he didn't bother to hide. One of the younger crew members near him noticed and looked away, suddenly very interested in the cable he was coiling. But Jessup wasn't done. He muttered something under his breath to the man beside him, who let out a short, nervous laugh that died almost immediately. Morgan didn't react. Maybe he hadn't heard. Maybe he'd heard things like it so many times in his career that he'd learned to let them slide off like water. He kept walking, finding his mark near the camera, exchanging a few words with Clint about the blocking for the next shot. But others had noticed. A black camera operator named Deshaun Williams had been close enough to catch fragments of what Jessup said. His jaw tightened, but he kept working. This wasn't his first rodeo. He knew how these things went. Make a scene, become the problem, watch your career evaporate. So he swallowed it and kept his eyes on his equipment. The morning dragged on with an unusual tension that nobody could quite name. Takes that should have been smooth needed multiple attempts. Equipment that had worked fine yesterday suddenly needed troubleshooting. Clint's mood shifted from focused to irritated, though he couldn't pinpoint why. Something was off. During a break between setups, Jessup's group grew louder again. More glances toward Morgan, More muttered comments followed by stifled laughter. A veteran grip named Charlie Medina finally walked over and said something quiet to Jessup. A warning, maybe. Jessup just shrugged and cracked open another soda. The fuse was lit. Nobody knew how short it was. The explosion came just after lunch. The crew had returned to set for an afternoon of interior shots, a tense scene between Clint and Morgan that required absolute silence and focus. Everyone was in position. The first assistant director called for quiet. Cameras were rolling. Clint and Morgan began the scene, their voices low and weighted with decades of regret. It was the kind of acting that made crew members forget they were working, the kind that reminded everyone why they'd gotten into this business in the first place. Take one was almost perfect. "Cut. Let's go again," Clint said quietly. "Morgan, let's try it with a longer pause before your last line." As the crew reset, Morgan stepped back to grab a water bottle from a production assistant. That's when Ray Jessup's voice cut through the quiet. Not a mutter this time, but loud enough for at least a dozen people to hear clearly. "Somebody get the water boy a banana while you're at it." Nervous silence. A few crew members looked at their feet. The production assistant, a young white woman, went pale and looked at Morgan with horror in her eyes. Morgan's hand froze on the water bottle. For a moment, his face showed nothing. Then something ancient and exhausted passed across his features, the look of a man who had been carrying a weight his whole life, and just felt it double. Deshaun Williams ripped off his headset. "What the hell did you just say?" Jessup turned, smirking. "I wasn't talking to you, boy. Mind your business." The temperature on set dropped 20 degrees. People started backing away, creating a circle without realizing it. Charlie Medina grabbed Deshaun's arm, holding him back. Don't give him what he wants." But the damage was done. The word hung in the air like poison gas. And then Jessup, emboldened by the silence, made the mistake that would end his career and nearly cost him his life. He looked directly at Morgan Freeman and said it. The full word, hard R loud enough for everyone to hear, including Clint Eastwood, who had just stepped around the camera. Time seemed to fracture into slow motion. Every person on that set would later remember the exact sequence of events with perfect clarity. The kind of memory that burns itself into your brain because your body knows it's witnessing something that can never be undone. Clint didn't say a word. He didn't shout. He didn't warn. He just moved. 62 years old, and he crossed that set faster than men half his age. Jessup barely had time to register what was happening before Clint's fist connected with his jaw. The sound was sickening, a wet crack that echoed off the soundstage walls. Jessup staggered but didn't fall, and that was his second mistake. "Clint, don't!" someone shouted. Maybe the first AD, maybe a producer. It didn't matter. Clint hit him again, and again. Each blow driven by something deeper than anger. Something that had been building for decades of watching people like Jessup poison every set, every space, every moment with their casual cruelty. Jessup's nose shattered. Blood sprayed across the dusty floorboards of the western set. "You don't talk to him like that," Clint growled, his voice barely human. "You don't talk to anyone like that." Jessup was on the ground now, trying to crawl away, his hand slipping in his own blood. Clint grabbed him by the collar and hauled him up, pinning him against a wooden beam. The entire crew stood frozen, too shocked to intervene, too afraid of what they were seeing. 30 years I've been in this business," Clint snarled into Jessup's bloody face. "And I've watched men like you hide behind your little jokes and your little comments. Not on my set. Not ever." Morgan Freeman finally stepped forward, placing a hand on Clint's shoulder. His voice was calm, steady, the same voice that would narrate 1,000 documentaries. "Clint, that's enough. He's done." Clint's grip didn't loosen. His breath came in ragged gasps, his knuckles split and bleeding. For a long moment, no one was sure what he would do. "Clint, Morgan repeated softly. "Let him go. He's not worth it." Clint released him. Jessup crumpled to the floor. Jessup lay on the ground, barely conscious, blood pooling beneath his shattered face. Two crew members finally rushed forward to check on him while someone screamed for a medic. But Clint wasn't finished. He stood over the broken man, chest heaving, fists still clenched at his sides, looking down with a disgust that went beyond anything physical. "Get him off my set," Clint said, his voice low and trembling with barely contained rage. "Get him off my lot, and if I ever see his face again, anywhere in this industry, I will end him." Nobody doubted he meant it. A production assistant was already on the phone with an ambulance. Jessup was moaning now, spitting blood and teeth onto the dusty floor. His jaw was clearly broken, hanging at an angle that made people look away. 3 ribs would later be confirmed fractured. His career in Hollywood was over before the paramedics even arrived. But then something happened that no one expected. Clint turned away from Jessup and walked directly to Morgan Freeman. The two men stood face to face in the middle of the silent set, surrounded by 100 crew members who had forgotten how to breathe. "I'm sorry," Clint said, his voice cracking for the first time. "I'm sorry you had to hear that. I'm sorry anyone ever made you feel like you had to just take it." Morgan looked at his friend, his director, his co-star, the man who had just committed assault in his defense, and did something extraordinary. He pulled Clint into an embrace. Right there, in front of everyone, the two men held each other like brothers. The crew watched in stunned silence. Some were crying. Deshaun Williams had his hand over his mouth, tears streaming down his face. Charlie Medina crossed himself and looked up at the rafters, like he was searching for God. When Clint and Morgan finally separated, Clint wiped his face with a bloody hand, smearing red across his cheek. He looked around at his crew, every single person frozen in place, and said quietly, "We're done for today. Go home. Hug your families." Production shut down for 5 days. The official story was scheduling adjustments. The real story never made it past the studio gates. Warner Brothers executives flew in from New York, lawyers drafted documents, and every person who witnessed the incident signed agreements that guaranteed their silence with a combination of generous bonuses and implicit threats. Ray Jessup was paid off and disappeared. Some said he moved to Florida. Others said he drank himself to death within a decade. Nobody in Hollywood ever hired him again. Not because of the NDAs, but because word travels in ways that paper can't stop. His name became a whisper, a warning, a ghost story told to new crew members about what happens when you cross certain lines on certain sets. Clint never spoke about it publicly. When journalists occasionally probed about behind-the-scenes conflicts on Unforgiven, he would simply say, "We had a family on that set. Families protect each other." Those who knew understood exactly what he meant. Morgan Freeman accepted his Academy Award nomination that year with characteristic grace, never hinting at what had happened. But in private moments, with people he trusted, he would sometimes talk about Clint with a reverence that went beyond professional respect. "That man showed me something I'd never seen before," he once told a close friend. A white man who didn't just disagree with racism, he was willing to bleed over it. The bond between them only deepened in the years that followed. They would work together again on $1 Million Baby, another Oscar triumph, and their on-screen chemistry always carried an unspoken weight that audiences could feel but never quite explain. It was trust. It was history. It was blood. Decades later, a retired camera operator who had been on set that day was asked about the most memorable moment of his career. He paused for a long time before answering. "I watched Clint Eastwood prove that some things matter more than movies," he said quietly. "More than money. More than your career. I watched him show us what a man is supposed to be, and I never forgot it."